Good evening. My name is Carol Shaw, and on behalf of the Romney Historic Landmarks Commission that has been doing this for about 2.5 years, we welcome you to our Romney on the Menu, which you might wonder why that name came up. We started at lunchtime, it was a brown bag, then we switched for evening, and I know it's dinner time, but this is the time that the facility was open and we just grabbed it for free, so a nice community event. This evening we have a treat, and you all know it's a treat because look how many people are here. We've got Jane McBride and Judy Buckbee who are going to share information about 4 of the marvelous homes on the South Branch. And so I'm not going to take much more time other than just thank Ken Caldwell, who always tapes our Romney on the Menu, and if you ever want to see some of them, go to YouTube and just type in, search for Oral History of Romney, West Virginia. And tonight we have our
technical advisor.
Oh, thank you. I was just wondering what to call Dan Oates, who's hiding behind the screen.
Yeah, we can't see.
History nerd.
History nerd, doesn't mind being called it, who has helped project all these pictures for Jane and Judy. So Judy here is going to start, and then Jane, and then Judy again. Yeah. So good.
Then go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to stand so people in the back can see me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. We are taking these homes in the order, not that they are coming up the valley, but in the order that they were built. So I'm going to begin with the house at the Rocks, down on Route 28. Everybody knows where it is, where the big cliff is over the river. It was the oldest. Then Jane will take her home, Riverside, and then I'll finish up with Ashbrook, which was the old Vance house, is the old Vance house, and Green Meadows, which people don't know too much about. But it was my grandfather's place. He had it built. People in the South Branch Valley have always had a strong interest in preserving the history of their families and their homes and passing it along to coming generations. The stories and records have been shared among the folks who lived here forever. The more one researches the histories of these families on, quote, branch, I got that from Jane Wright Slocum. I never heard it called the branch before until Jane did. I like it. So the families on the branch, the more evident is the interwoven fabric of these stories of the first settlers, their descendants, and their shared heritage. These families and those who follow them possess a treasure trove of family heirlooms, photos, documents, stories, and memories of a bygone era. Just to give credit to a few references I used, Historic Hampshire by Selden W. Brannan, Hampshire County, West Virginia, 1754 to 2004, was edited by Roberta R. Munsky and Wilmer L. Kearns, and The Rocks, which was a document prepared for the Blue Reunion by David Parsons Barker. Now this sequence of ownership gets a little bit long for the Rocks, and it's kind of like reading the Bible when they say so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. It gets a little long, but bear with me. It gets more interesting. Can everybody hear okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. On August 17th, 1749, a parcel of land from the Fairfax Land Grant, Lot 27, called the Manor of Wapakoma, was deeded to John Blue and his wife, Margaret Kaiser Blue of Hampshire County, Virginia. By one account, a cabin was built in 1747. Other accounts say that Uriah Blue and Susanna Williams Blue built a cabin in 1779. In any event, the Blues had built a home and were living on Lot 27 by 1779, probably long before. Lot 27 was passed from John Blue to his third son, Uriah. In 1770, Uriah married Susanna Williams, the eldest daughter of the Williams family of Lot 32. In 1814, 15, and 16, after the deaths of Uriah and Susanna, Lot 27 passed to Uriah Blue Jr. Uriah married Elizabeth Donaldson of Green Spring Valley around 1910, and they had one daughter named Susan. In 1836, Susan married Isaac Parsons, third son of James and Mary Casey Parsons, who lived at Fairfax Lot 21. Susan and Isaac remained at Lot 21 and had no children. Following in 1854 and 57, following the deaths of Uriah and Elizabeth Blue, Lot 27 went to their only child, Susan. In 1867, Susan Blue Parsons gave Lot 27 to her oldest son, Isaac Parsons Jr., as a wedding present when he married Emma Chaplin Taylor Waddle, third daughter of Julius and Mary Jane Waddle of Capon Springs. Isaac and Emma had no children. In 1891 and 1898, after the deaths of Isaac Jr. and Emma, his wife, Lot 27 went to their, now wait, this doesn't sound right. They had 6 children. I'm sorry, I said no children. These bifocals. Gotta get this up. Okay. Isaac and Emma had 6 children. And after their deaths, Lot 27 went to all 6 of the children. 3 married and left Hampshire County, leaving Isaac, or Ike as he was better known, Susan and Alice at the Rocks. Susan. No, I'm okay. Susan Blue Parsons married Charles Rowe and moved to Southern Virginia. They had no children. Following Mr. Rowe's death, Susan returned to her home at the Rocks. Also in 1932, her brother Ike Parsons died unmarried. Susan Rowe's sister Alice died in 1944, also unmarried. These events left Susan Parsons Rowe with ownership of Lot 27, the home and farm at the Rocks. Mrs. Rowe, experiencing major health issues in 1952, retained Mr. and Mrs. Carmen and Aldina Buckbee to manage the farm and care for her until her death in 1959. After her death, Mr. and Mrs. Buckbee acquired the house and remaining acreage from her estate. Mr. and Mrs. Buckbee had 2 children, Sandra and Gary. Both were small children when they moved to the Rocks. Following the passing of Carmen in 1987 and Aldina in 2007, the Rocks was left to their children. The house and acreage on the west side of Route 28 went to the older child, Sandra. Mr. and Mrs. Buckbee left the woodland on the east side of Route 28 to their son, Gary. Sandra gifted her share of the farm to her only child, Sean P. Rader. The home is now owned and occupied by Sean's son, Shane Rader, and his wife, Jen. And they're with us tonight, hiding over there at the end of the road. Okay, lost my place. I'm sorry.
Thinking about ice cream.
The following is a narrative. I just pulled excerpts from the one written by David Parsons Brackett. He was the great-great-grandson of Susan Blue Parsons. Lot 27 became known as the Rocks for the beautiful rock formations where the South Branch of the Potomac River cuts through Mill Creek Mountain. For a time it was called Wapakoma, taken from the American Indian word Wapatomaka, their name for the South Branch. That name was used by the railroad in the 1880s when the Rocks became a regular stop for the train for passengers as well as freight and mail. Wapakoma and the Rocks, spelled R-O-X, were used at various times on correspondence, etc. I laid a copy of some correspondence here on the table, front and back, that show that. The house itself sits on high ground. It's close to the river with a good spring for drinking water and an excellent view up the valley toward Romney. Built of yellow poplar logs, pine ceiling beams, and stone fireplaces made from nearby cliffs. The log walls are now covered with siding and the roof is of sheet metal. The owners, following Mrs. Rowe, have done a wonderful job of maintaining the home and farm, restoring and repairing as needed, but keeping many of the original features. The complexion of the farm has always been the raising of livestock and crops. This changed for a while after Isaac Parsons Jr. married Emma Waddle in 1867. Emma's parents and their families each ran hotels and resorts in Virginia and West Virginia for several generations. In fact, Isaac met Emma at her parents' resort at Capon Springs. He was there recuperating from a shoulder wound received at Brandy Station during the Civil War. I might note I looked up Capon Springs in another book and there was no mention of the Waddle's name, so I'm not sure if that's accurate or not. That would take a little more research. But nevertheless, the other picture on the table there shows a guest house that was built to accommodate all the visitors at the Rocks. With the abundant natural resources and beauty available, combined with Emma's knowledge, the Rocks started to receive guests. With the arrival of the railroad in the 1880s, the demand increased. So in the 1890s, a large guest house was erected near the original home. This was a two-story prefab structure, supposedly brought in on the train, with a large front porch. The first floor was living and dining space. The second floor consisted of sleeping rooms. A new railroad siding allowed wealthy guests to stay in their private cars. Many notable guests from Washington, D.C. and Pittsburgh came, including President Cleveland and Herbert Hoover. The original guest book remains at the Rocks as a record of this period of time. Is that correct, Shane? You still have it there? Okay. The post office was in the main house and attended by Maud Parsons, who was reportedly the first postmistress in West Virginia. In 1930, after Isaac and Emma passed on and some of the children married and left, the burden became too great for those remaining. The guest house was torn down in the 1930s and only a few special guests continued to come into the 40s. As a note, there is a lot of American Indian history and Civil War stories about battles along the road under the cliffs by the river. And I'm not going to attempt to get into that or we'd be here till next week. So I'm going to turn this over to Jane.
Can you hear me? It's never been a problem in the past, so I thought it wouldn't be tonight. Judy's a very hard act to follow. I'm going to speak to you a little bit about my home place. When people say to me, how long have you lived on Riverside? I say, well, the Mayflower sailed and I came over this way shortly thereafter. But Riverside was built by William Foreman in approximately 1790. If you will look, I have a replica of the survey done by Thomas Lord Fairfax of Britain, and it is dated approximately 1740. Lord Fairfax was the Baron of Cameron, and he employed George Washington. However, we have no knowledge that Washington surveyed our farm, but for the sake of, let's just say for the sake of gossip, let's say it's a possibility. How about that? The land was granted to William Foreman in 1790. And I believe Dan has, it was approximately 375 acres. And I do have that grant there framed after the presentation. If you all would like to take a look, you're welcome to. It was then transferred from William Foreman to Foreman Inskip. However, William Foreman received some notoriety as a result of Fort Foreman, and there is some question about the location of Fort Foreman, but it's always been assumed that it was on the hill just opposite Riverside. The trenches are around the hill on 3 sides, and there is a marker on Route 28 signifying Fort Foreman. I'm going to read you what the marker says. Frontier Outpost, Captain William Foreman, in 1777, led a company from this county to the relief of Fort Henry at Wheeling. He, 2 sons, and others were killed in an ambush by Native Americans at the, quote, Narrows, near Moundsville. I think if Dan has that picture, you may recognize Virginia Pancake. She was a pillar of the community and was instrumental in getting this marker reestablished after the '85 flood. As I said, from William Foreman, Riverside was transferred to Foreman Inskip. And I do have a copy of Foreman Inskip's will. And then in 1882, Foreman Inskip deeded the property to Levi Inskip. The home received somewhat of a notoriety insofar as there was a robbery in 1912. And I believe Dan has the picture of the article. I found it when I was going through some old things of my father's. My dad was a pack rat, I'm a pack rat, and we may as well admit it. It was rolled up, and when I took it to the conservator, he said, oh, this is like trying to put together confetti. But it is the original newspaper article of the robbery, and I'm going to read a couple of the excerpts from it, if you all will indulge me. I do have a picture of Mr. Inskip also. Dan, do you have that?
Yeah, it's up here at the top.
Okay. He was a very formidable looking feller. And the headline is Attempted Robbery, November 27, 1912. L.C. Inskip puts 1 Negro out of business. Not real politically correct, but that's what it says. Bloodhounds failed to catch up with the fleeing Negro, and efforts are still being made to find him. The citizens of Hampshire County and Romney and the surrounding community were startled Saturday morning when, just after daylight, it was learned that a dastardly attempt had been made at robbery at the home of Lee Inskip, 2 miles below Romney. That Mr. Inskip had been shot in the head by one of the robbers, getting off, however, with only a scalp wound, and that he had succeeded in killing one of the robbers. In one of the pictures that I will show in a few minutes, there is a bullet hole that we still maintain in one of the door facings of the house, just to prove that it's true. Prosecuting attorney Zimmerman and Justice Maloney went immediately to the Inskip residence where an inquest was held. The story is best told in Mr. Inskip's own words. His evidence being as followed. Are you all interested in this?
Sure.
Okay, I don't want to bore you. Quote, when I went up to milk this morning at 6:30, I opened the cowshed door and these two men pointed their revolvers at my face and demanded money. They were inside the cowshed. I told them I had no money. They wanted to know if I had money in the bank. I told them yes. One of them put his revolver to my eye and said he would kill me if I didn't draw him the check. Who takes a check when you're milking a cow? But I digress. One of them digress. They demanded a check for $400 to be drawn payable to the bearer. I was to phone the next door neighbor down at the big brick house, that would be Patricia's Ashbrook, and have them go and get the money. They said they had been watching this house and they knew everybody in the neighborhood. They said they had dynamite under the house and had dynamite there. They were prepared.
They're serious, right?
One of them said to the other, quote, you go get the dynamite and show him. One then got up in the loft over the cowshed and got 3 sticks, which are the same I herewith file. I guess he carried them to the inquest. One of them also said they had a man watching on the top of the hill. They then wanted to know who was at the house, how many people, if any, were there. I told them who was there, 3 women, naming them, no man. One asked if we didn't have a cook. I told him, yes, she's there. I forgot to name her. I argued with them about the amount. They agreed first to reduce the amount to $200. And it continues. Then to $150. I had agreed to give them $100 if they would let me off. They would not go below $150. And said they would shoot me unless I drew a check for that amount. They wanted me to draw it up there, but I told them I couldn't as I had no check, milking cows, and no way to write it if I had. They said they would go to the house with me and I could fix it up. When we started to the house, they looped a rope around my wrists with my hands behind me, and one held the rope and walked with me. The other ran ahead. One ran to the room where Mrs. Harper and Mrs. Fetchig were. The other one came down to the dining room, leading me with him. Then he pushed the door open and pointed the revolver at my wife and followed her into the room. About this time, he saw Mary Heath standing in the door leading into the dining room from the kitchen, and he went toward her. This freed me temporarily, and I stepped from the dining room into the adjoining room and threw it into the hall where I got my Winchester rifle. When they saw me with the rifle, one of them ran from the house toward the orchard. I shot at him and he ran, emptying my gun, which only had a few loads in it, but I did not think that I struck him. Then I returned to the house and got my shotgun. Just as I got my pistol aimed at him, I shot immediately and he fell dead inside the door. I was shot in the head but can't tell just when or where it was done, owing to the excitement and confusion, I guess so, and the wound being slight, a glancing wound around the head. The fellow who was killed had an empty shell in his revolver when it was found, and he may have shot as I did. Or it may have been done by the other fellow as he ran. This fellow shot at me as he ran, and I shot at him, and I think he shot at me before I got the rifle. This part is a little hazy, and I cannot absolutely testify to those details positively. These men each wore masks, and their faces were painted white or some white substance on them, and they wore gauntlet-type gloves. They both were entirely disguised. They each carried revolvers and had them out all the time when they first held me up in the barn. The fellow who ran lost his hat in the yard where it was picked up, and it is here filed. The verdict. Y'all ready for this? I think we have some esteemed attorneys here. Would you all like to venture a verdict? We, the jury of the inquest, appointed to view the body of a man lying dead at the home of L.C. Inskip and report he came to his death, find after viewing the body and hearing the evidence before us that the deceased came to his death from a gunshot wound inflicted by Mr. Inskip. That the deceased and his companion were highwaymen in the act of using their pistols to rob Mr. Inskip. And at that time, Mr. Inskip was shot. The homicide was entirely justified, and we find no blame attached to Mr. Inskip at all. It is signed C.W. Parsons, J.S. Waddle, R.M. Washington, Thomas Long, and H.M. Vance. It goes on to identify the deceased, if you all want to hear the rest of the story. Oh, all right, are you on the edge of your chairs?
Better to see us up.
Goodness. The highwayman killed was none other than French Hardy, a young Negro born and raised in this community, the son of Boyd Hardy. It was he who assaulted Mary Heath, a white woman cook in Mr. Inskip's kitchen, referred to in this testimony. Hardy struck her several times over the head with the butt of a revolver, beating her almost into insensibility. It was quite a day at Riverside. While Mr. Inskip could not be positive, but it was unquestionably the same Negro who shot him. The pistol, doubtless being fired coincident with Mr. Inskip's shot through the villain's breast, killing him instantly. A telephone message to Cumberland brought bloodhounds with their owner by 10 o'clock that morning. The fleeing Negro's hack gave the scent which the dogs took. A crowd of armed men accompanied the dogs, and pursuit of the escaped desperado was taken up. The trail leading eastward across the hills toward Jersey Mountain. The search was kept up during Saturday night and Sunday, but no trace could be found of him. Almost noon on Saturday, he went to Height Washington's house near Springfield, and at the point of a pistol, compelled Height to give him his dinner. By this appearance, it was established that the fleeing Negro was A.L. Hardy, a brother of the one who was killed, and who had taught school in the county and in Mineral County. Oh, I bet the Board of Education was happy with that. The prosecuting attorney found 2 envelopes, addressed one to A.L. Hardy, the other to a woman, both in Columbus, Ohio, and it was supposed that it was for the purpose of the robbers to enclose the money in these and mail them at once, so that if searched, the robbers had no incriminating evidence to be found on them. It's known that Hardy slept Saturday night in the Negro schoolhouse, a mile and a half from Frankfort, where he had taught school last winter. Joseph Higgins, 14 years old, riding horseback, saw smoke from the chimney of the schoolhouse, and thinking that a service of some kind was in progress, he rode up and peered through the window. He discovered Hardy lying on a bench asleep. Higgins gave an alarm, but when the posse arrived, Hardy, who evidently knew that he had been discovered, had flown. He was last seen Sunday afternoon going over the hill back of Harry Young's house near Pinto. By an advertisement in this issue, it will be seen that Andrew Smith, an uncle of the Hardy Negroes, who was sent to the penitentiary for forgery last summer, will make application to the pardon attorney to be released from the institution. However, I don't know what that has to do with it, but it was in there. As we go to press Tuesday morning, the fugitive Negro is still at large, although a posse with the bloodhounds keeps searching for him in the neighborhood of Patterson's Creek. Various rumors of him being seen, the current rumor had it that he was seen near Pinto just before 2 trains going in opposite directions passed. After they passed, he had disappeared, leading to the belief that he had boarded one of them. His wounded hand will give an identification should he be seen. A reward of $200 has been offered for his apprehension, dead or alive.
What year was this?
This is 1912. And you have the picture, we do have the review article. It was in the Hampshire Review. Okay, let me talk a little bit about Riverside, and I've probably taken most of Judy's time, so. Riverside passed from Levi and Skip to my grandparents, Richard S. Kirkendall Sr. and Virginia Lee Pancake Kirkendall. And I believe Dan has a picture of them. Riverside is a 10-room Georgian-style home. Originally, as most of you all know, the road was where the railroad track is now, and therefore the front of the house is now the back of the house. I have pictures of a gazebo with my grandmother holding me. That was back in the Stone Age, but we digress. And of course, the gazebo was the gathering place for all illustrious folks in the area, and you'll see some very illustrious looking fellows seated under the gazebo, probably having lemonade or not. There are 2 pieces of furniture in Riverside that, rumor has it, have been there since it was built. One is the grandfather clock, and the other is a secretary that's in the main living room, and I did not bring a picture of it. But the grandfather clock, I always assumed it was an 8-day clock. It is not. My father was a fastidious pack rat, and he had placed a little documentation of provenance in the clock stating that one needed to wind it every day to day and a half, and that the springs in the clock were very sensitive, and the weights in the clock are very heavy, so the legs of the clock started to split. We do have all of the pieces, and it is in working order, but we haven't wound it for several years. We do have a musket. Judy alluded to some Civil War activity at the Rocks, and about 10 years after the war, one of the folks at the Rocks was fishing, the story goes, and he hooked a Civil War musket. Apparently, the Confederate troops were on top of the Rocks. The Union troops were down below. And when the Confederate troops started to fire, the Union troops became very frightened. Some of them jumped into the river and they were drowned. And anyway, these gentlemen around 1930, 35, 40, well, about 10 years after the war, they found the musket, and in approximately 1940, it was gifted to an uncle of mine. 85 was an interesting year for Riverside. You can see we did have some flood damage. We were one of the few homes on the branch that did not get water in the living area. However, it was approximately 3 inches from coming in the back door. Pretty damn close. And it was in the basement, and it was running out the front porch. That was quite an event. We do currently, my husband's in the back, my husband Greg McBride, and I have lived at Riverside for 37 years. And our current project is restoring the summer kitchen. There is a friend of mine in the back, Vicki, who refers to it as her house. She hopes to live there when I get too feeble to take care of myself. But we are in the process of restoring the summer kitchen, and it's going fairly well, but it's a money pit like any other old home. I will be happy to answer any questions when we conclude this. Thank you for your attention.
Yes. Does anybody want to take a short break before we start the last two?
Or we'll take questions. We're halfway through, so.
We're halfway.
Any questions?
Can I say something?
Sure.
Your father
Yes.
took me to the house one time and said, Beverly, I was little, I didn't know how old I was, but he said, do you know why the windows in this house are so high? And of course I said, no, I don't know why. And he said, it was built this way so the Indians couldn't look in.
That's correct. The walls are triple thickness of brick. The brick is laid in Flemish bond style. The main doors of the house still have the original hinges, and they are 2.5 or 3 feet long. And one thing I neglected to mention, speaking of my father, who had an interesting sense of humor, and my mother was pretty fiery also and had a pretty good grasp of the English vernacular. The chandelier in our main living room hung probably about where we're seated right now in the New Century Hotel dining room. There was a sale in the, I guess, late 60s probably.
Yeah, you got it. It's the top one.
Late 60s. My father bought the chandelier. He was as proud as peaches of it. Came toting it in, and Mother said, well, how much did you pay for that? Well, I paid $100. Well, I think she was thinking about heading to Romney and seeing a divorce attorney. But it is one of our prized possessions. And if you note in the back of the chandelier, I neglected to mention, rumor has it that traveling artisans would go from plantation or farm to farm. They were doing the paneling in the homes. And so each room in Riverside, in the high part of the house, has paneling on one wall, and the paneling is just a little bit different in each room, therefore kind of adding credibility to traveling artisans. They would stay on the farm long enough to do one room, then they would move on and do another room, do another home.
When you say artisans, did they They were carpenters?
Yes.
Carpenters.
We assume, yes. And they did the paneling.
It's not murals.
No, you'll see if you look,
Oh, I see. Yes, I see.
raised panels.
Right there, raised panels.
Pictures are terrible, I'm sorry.
What year was the house built?
1790.
Was it all built at one time?
It was, and then approximately 20 years after it was built, the lower part started to pull away from the higher part, and so they tore it down and rebuilt it at about 1810, we think.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've been in there, but it seemed like the part that Aunt Virginia lived in, you went up into the part that your father and mother lived in too.
The upper part, the high part, is the original part. But I want you to look at this picture, Eve. I found a picture that's labeled Riverside, and it shows, it's clearly the house. It has the porch along the front. Well, it would have been the back originally, but it shows dormer windows. And I never have seen a picture of the house with dormer windows. So maybe when the lower part of the house started to pull away, they redid the roof line. It looks like it was all one level in that picture.
Were the bricks from the property? Do you know?
Rumor has it
I know what you're going to say, bro.
that the bricks were fired on the property between our house, between Riverside and Ashbrook. And Judy is going to talk about Ashbrook. It was built a little later than Riverside, but the kiln was supposedly between the two houses. Any other questions?
What was the roof originally? Do you know?
I do not. And I don't know if we can tell, Mike, from that picture or not. I'm not sure.
So their house really hasn't changed all that much, has it?
No, it has not.
Which is wonderful.
No. And it has only been in 3 families. It was built by the Foremans, it went to the Inskips, to the Kirkendalls, McBride.
Jane, are any of the original outbuildings still there, or are they more modern plus there now?
The summer kitchen is still there, the summer kitchen. And when I was a child, I can remember a log barn, but it has since fallen. It fell probably in the early 60s. I was a young child and it was in bad shape. The barn, the big red barn that is there, was built in the 30s. My grandparents acquired the property in 1934, and my father and his brothers had the barn built by Belt of Belt Construction, Carl Belt.
Were there slaves there also?
Yes,
How about their house, the slave house, and those, where was that, do you know?
I'm sure it was on the property.
You're not sure where it was?
Yes, I do.
Do you know what they grew on the farm? Was it?
I'm sorry?
Do you know what they grew on the farm?
It was a working farm, cattle, corn, various crops that are indigenous to this area. My father had it as a working cattle farm. And in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, we owned the property across the river also. And one of the highlights of my childhood was getting to help drive the cattle down the riverbank and help swim them across the river.
Wow.
I wasn't trying to be evasive, Mike, when you asked that. There is a summer kitchen there, so I am sure that there were house slaves and then there were field slaves. I do not know where that was. Any other question?
How many fireplaces?
Too many. There's a fireplace in every room in the high part of the house, with the exception of the 2 halls, downstairs and the upstairs. And there is a full basement and 2 full attics. There's a separate attic over the lower part and a separate attic on the high part. Yes, fireplace in the kitchen. Thank you for your attention.
All right. The next farm, Jane, you said Riverside was built in 1790, correct?
Correct?
Okay. Even though the bricks were supposedly made at the same location for the farm that came Ashbrook, which came to be known as the Vance Place, it was not built until 1834. The land was deeded to Ashbrook. I don't have his first name, but from the Lord Fairfax grant. And in 1834, Ashbrook was sold to Henry Macker Inskip and his wife Susan Vance Inskip. Now this gets a little confusing. Henry Macker Inskip and his wife Susan Vance Inskip. The house was built by Mr. Inskip for their marriage. Following Henry Macker Inskip's death, Susan Vance Inskip left the house and land east of the river to her daughter, Mary Elizabeth Inskip, who married her cousin, John T. Vance. The land west of the river went to Susan's son, John J. Inskip. John T. and Mary Elizabeth Vance left Ashbrook, now referred to as the Vance Place, to their son, Henry Macker Vance, who married Hannah Blue Guthrie. Henry Macker Vance died many years before his wife Hannah. Their son William was killed by the train in front of the house at age 15, it is said on Christmas Day. Hannah continued to live at the home with their only other child, Frances, the daughter, Frances. After Hannah's death, the farm was left to Frances, who lived there alone for several years. We have the picture up there of Frances and also one of she and her brother William. When Frances passed away around 1972, I didn't have time to look that up, so I guessed. She named 2 of her first cousins as beneficiaries in her will. Lucilla Guthrie Edmonds of Washington, D.C. area, and Mary Elizabeth Kump of Romney became joint owners. Mrs. Edmonds bought from Mrs. Kump her 50% share and retained ownership for several years. Mrs. Edmonds ultimately sold the property to Patricia Moore, who is here tonight, of McLean, Virginia, who is still the current owner. Those who remember Frances Vance and her mother Hannah will recall that for many years they kept chickens as well as 1 or 2 milk cows. A large separator was in the kitchen, and after gathering the eggs, processing the milk into cream and making butter, Frances would make deliveries of their farm products to folks up the valley and into town. How many people here remember that? Jane, right? Yeah, Beverly. Yeah.
I would never eat margarine. All I ever knew was butter.
Right, right. Over the years, the Vances also had a small income from the rental of the riverfront lots. Several housing lots were also sold at various times on both sides of Route 28. Gary and Judy Buckbee purchased the remaining acreage on the east side of the highway. Around 1972, Frances, now living alone, suffered a fatal stroke. Following her death, Mary Elizabeth Kump asked the Buckbees if they would be interested in moving into the house in order to maintain heat and utilities until she and Mrs. Edmonds could reach an agreement on the future of the estate. Ultimately, Mrs. Edmonds purchased the 50% ownership held by Mrs. Kump with hopes of retiring early to the farm. This never materialized, and by 1974, Gary and Judy built their current home on the east side of the highway. The house was still completely furnished in the original period furniture. Sorry. Over the coming years, the house was rented or it was left vacant for long periods of time. A few of the pieces were removed by Mrs. Edmonds and Mrs. Kump to be kept in their families. Gradually, all the other furnishings disappeared, even down to the antique picture frames and cast iron toys. The flood of 1985 also took its toll, washing away some log outbuildings and filling the cellar and a few feet of the first floor in the house. Mrs. Edmonds ultimately agreed to sell the farm to Patricia Moore of McLean, and it is still in her possession. Okay, we've had all the picture. That's up there now.
This one's the big one's up.
Oh, okay. All right. The big one.
Yeah.
Okay. That picture is a painting that is found in, what did I say his name was?
Pictorial history in there. Terms of
History of Hampshire County, West Virginia, Hampshire, West Virginia. Anyway, the painting was done by Barry Vance, who is a distant relative on the Vance side of the family, and I believe he lives in Winchester. Anyway, this was found in this book, and I just took a picture of it. I hope I'm not violating some major copyright. But
There are no attorneys here to get you out of jail.
okay, that's good. As the picture is painted as though Barry were on the other side of the river, looking east, because this home also faced the river, because the old road followed in front of both of those homes, and ultimately the railroad track did too, but it wasn't there yet. So you might want to look a little closer at that. There's a lot of details in it. And also pictures of Henry Macker, Inskip, and Susan E. Vance that the house was built for. We have a summer kitchen there too, don't we? There's also a picture of a photograph of the back. You can see the back portion of the brick home, but the stone building was the summer kitchen. And it's still standing. Let's see. Okay, we have some pictures of various members of the family on the river in a flatboat, looks like. I believe the one in the center is Henry Macker Vance, and I think his wife Hannah is the one hiding behind the other lady in the front. Then the picture of a man alone in a boat is Henry Macker Vance. The next pictures are of his wife, Hannah Guthrie Vance. And the following pictures are of, oh, I thought we had those a while ago.
we did.
Okay. William and Frances Vance, the children of Henry Macker Vance and Hannah Guthrie Vance. Okay, are there any questions on that home?
You mentioned Guthrie. Is that the Guthrie from Robbie Pancake's house?
Which pancakes, Robbie?
Robbie?
I don't,
Guthrie.
there's probably a connection, probably like that, but I didn't know anything about that. There was also a Guthrie at Springfield, right on the turn, that have a funeral home there.
Okay.
And there were several in the family. So, but I'm just sticking to the one. I can't keep up with all of them. Okay, the last home that I'm going to cover is called Green Meadows, and it was built in 1900. Or the home at Green Meadows is not as historic or as elegant as the larger brick homes along the river valley. However, it holds special significance to me because it's where my mother and her siblings grew up. I've been told it was the first home along this section of the valley to have an indoor bathroom and running water. What a luxury. There were several girls in the family, so I guess they had to have a bathroom. Frank L. Harmison was the youngest son of Charles and Betty Smith Harmison, who lived at Valley View, now the home of Bob Mayhew. Frank was born in 1870, and he was the only of their children to be born there. They had lived elsewhere previous to that. Frank remained a bachelor until he was 30. In 1900, he acquired a portion of the Valley View farmland. There on a knoll which afforded a beautiful view of the valley below, he built a home and named it Green Meadows. This home is barely visible from the present Route 28, but at the time it was built, it was very near the old road into town. It was to Green Meadows that Frank brought his new bride, Elizabeth French Guthrie, or Lizzie, as she was known to friends and family. Lizzie and Hannah Vance at the Vance place, 2 farms down, were sisters. They were both from the same Guthrie family. Frank and Lizzie began their family with the birth of a son, Michael Blue, in 1904. His birth was followed by the arrival of 7 girls. Sadly, 3 of the girls did not live to adulthood. The remaining 4 were Elizabeth Bell, Blanche, who married Maya Jane's uncle, one of her uncles, Mary Frances, who was my mother, and Hannah Blue, Beverly's mother. Lizzie gave birth to another son, Frank Jr., but due to complications during childbirth, neither she nor the baby survived. This left Frank with 4 little girls to raise on his own. I feel sure there were many happy times at Green Meadows, but also much sadness due to the loss of the 3 daughters, followed by the deaths of Lizzie and Frank Jr. in 1922. In 1923, Frank married his second wife, Willie Raines, who was a wonderful stepmother to the little girls. Willie had been raised by the Inskips across the river, later lived with and helped with the children at Washington Bottom, and ultimately was employed as a house parent at the schools for the deaf and blind. Frank's oldest child, Michael, graduated from the Potomac Academy, went into the military, attended college, and then settled in Green Bay, Wisconsin with his wife, Helen. Eventually, 3 of the 4 sisters married and left the farm. Betty Bell, or her real name was Elizabeth, remained at home and was in delicate health all her life due to rheumatic fever, which damaged her heart. Following Frank's death in 1942, the farm was left to his wife, Willie. She sold Green Meadows to Susan Ewers, and then Willie and Betty Bell moved into town. The Ewers family owned Green Acres for many years. It was rented to various families until the 1970s or 80s, when Arthur Ewers lived there. Despite the elevation, the waters of the 1985 flood reached the house, and Arthur was forced to leave it. The lovely home at Green Meadows was vacant and neglected until, and I don't have this date, I was hoping that Ken Hopkins and Linda DeChambeau would be here tonight, but they didn't make it. They could give me the date. Green Meadows was purchased by Ken and Linda, and they took on the task of restoring and renovating the farmhouse and are living there at this time. So it's really nice to know that it's being cared for again.
Yes.
Where's it located?
You know where the old cold storage building is, next to the Potomac Eagle?
Right.
Okay, the old road, it's about halfway between the old cold storage and on up toward town to Valley View where Bob Mayhew has a home. So it's up in the river bottom.
Is it at the foot of the mountain right by the railroad track on the other side?
It's very close to the railroad track. When you drive up around the hill, after you pass the Parsons house and the cold storage and start up the hill going toward
Okay.
Romney, before the trees got so big and whenever the leaves were off in the wintertime, you could get a glimpse of it down over that hill. But now it's really hard to see it.
If you drive out the industrial park driveway and where the cycle shop is, go to the end of the parking lot and look over, you'll have a good view.
Okay. I'm not done that.
You can see it a little bit from the Potomac Eagle when it gets
Yes.
by.
Right, right. If you look real quick.
Yeah, that's what I remember, looking quickly.
Right. Of course, the pictures I have of it here, the front of the house, this was before Ken and Linda began any renovations on it. And the picture of the hayfield with the tractor in it, of course, is Ken Hopkins baling hay. So those are not real old pictures. But it was all I had. There are pictures of Frank and his bride, Elizabeth Guthrie Harmison. And then the following two pictures are family portraits of the family. The first one probably in 1910. Uncle Mike being the oldest, so I would guess his age to be about 6 in that picture. Then the next picture, he's about 13, so there's about a 7-year period in between there. The only child that we do not have a picture of was Hallie, and she's not shown in either one. She was one of the 2-year-old toddlers that didn't live. And even in the last picture, I believe the 2 little ones are my mother and my Aunt Blanche. And Hannah Blue has not been born yet. And, of course, Frank, the baby, didn't survive. The last pictures I have are of my grandfather with his produce truck. Has a sign on it that says, I don't know if I can read it on here. Can you read it, Dan?
Is it bigger out there?
Maybe. Well, anyway, he delivered produce to all over the community, mainly sweet corn. And then the advertising card below it says, always a square deal. Harmison's famous roasting years, Romney, West Virginia, with a phone number, and also delightful bungalows for rent, F.L. Harmison. I will return tomorrow if nothing happens to prevent. And the last picture I have here is of my grandfather and his second wife, Willie. Didn't have very many pictures of her during that period of time. Had some when she was older, but not living at Green Acres anymore. So that's all we have of Green Acres. Do we have questions?
Frank Harmison was your grandfather and Beverly's grandfather.
Correct.
So your mothers were
Sisters, right?
Are they related to the Harmisons that live near Glebe, way south?
Luther, probably right, the Luther Harmison farm. Is that right, Jane? Yeah. He was,
All related.
Yeah.
It's Hampshire
He
County.
was Ruth Parker. He was Ruth Parker's father.
right, Luther.
Yeah.
Because we live in Sector and we always knew the field out there that's now DNR as Harmison's. And they did have a house on the other side of the river there.
Right. I believe they were brothers. Is that right? I think they were.
Luther's father was a brother. Luther's father was a brother of Frank.
Okay. See, there was a big age span between the oldest of Frank's siblings and him because he was the baby. And so there were a lot of cousins that were really in different generations because of that. It's a little bit hard to sort them all out. I will say that my Aunt Blanche, who married Joe Kirkendall, Jane's uncle, did a family history back in, when, the 60s?
Late 60s. Those are her family histories also of the Kirkendall family.
Yeah.
So her
She did.
Aunt Blanche was also my Aunt Blanche, and she did both sides of the family.
She did 4 families. She did her family, which was the Guthries and the Harmisons, and she did Uncle Joe's families, which were
Pancakes.
Kirkendalls and Pancakes.
Right.
So she must have spent
For like
years working on that. And then she gave copies of it to all of her nieces and nephews. So, which sadly we haven't kept up to date very well, but we still have it. Any other questions? Guess not, so we're finished for tonight. Thanks for coming.